Buenos dias. How's everybody doing? We got a beautiful day, so I'm working outside. You may hear a little bit of noise in the background, but that's just because it's a nice day out, and I wanted to enjoy that particular aspect of this spring. Um, and when we finished up our last set of FBI notes called "The Cold War Gets Hot," that ended up with talking about something called the Cuban Missile Crisis, which was the closest that the world probably ever got to World War III. And we're going to be, over the next couple sets of FBI notes, we're going to be talking about the relationship that the United States has with the island of Cuba. We're pretty familiar with the relationship maybe that the United States has with the country of Mexico, but down in Florida in particular, as well as, Louisiana and places like that, you really have a big Cuban American population, and it has a lot to do with American history, and even in some cases, like the Cuban Missile Crisis, world history. So we're going to kind of delve into that just a little bit, and some of the lessons that we're talking about here have something to do with. You could apply the same thing to Mexican-American relations, but then some of them are just very unique to the Cuban-American experience. So yeah, it's just kind of an interesting thing here. You'll get to hear me talk a little bit, use my fake Spanish accent here. So I'll do the best that I can, and we'll see how it goes. So this one's called "Revolution in Cuba," and please follow along while I read. La Perla de las Antillas. The island of Cuba has had a long and complicated history with the United States. Cuba was discovered by Christopher Columbus on his first voyage to the New World in 1492. He described it as the fairest island human eyes have yet beheld. Upon landing, he claimed it and its native peoples for the King of Spain. For the next 400 years, Cuba was a colony of Spain. Cuba provided the Spanish Empire with enormous amounts of money due to its sugarcane plantations, which sold their product all over the world for the benefit of Spain. Because of that, as other Spanish colonies such as Mexico and Colombia gained independence in the 1800s, Spain fought ferociously to maintain control of Cuba. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal about sugar? It's just sugar. Oh, well, you can make sugar into rum. And as we learned in the Prohibition unit, well, alcohol sells all over the world. So rum is the big thing, made from sugar. So anyway, moving on. By the late 1800s, Cuba was on the verge of revolt. A brutal Spanish general named Valeriano Weyler enforced Spanish law upon the Cuban population. The Cuban independence movement under Jose Marti began to attack Spanish forces in the Cuban countryside. Viva Cuba Libre! Meanwhile, the United States was anxiously watching the events in Cuba. The island is only 90 miles from Key West, Florida, and is right in the middle of the Caribbean Sea, making it very important strategically. As the situation in Cuba grew unstable, the U.S. Navy sent the battleship Maine to the Cuban capital of Havana to monitor the situation. On February 15, 1898, the Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, killing 260 sailors. The American public cried out for revenge, and "Remember the Maine" became a rallying cry for Americans as they entered what became known as the Spanish-American War. Within a few months, Spain was defeated, and the USA occupied the former Spanish colonies of Cuba, Puerto Rico, and the Philippines in the Pacific. In truth, the Cuban rebels had already largely won their revolution against Spain by the time the Maine exploded, and were not excited to see American troops staying in their country after the war was over. The United States proved to be far less oppressive than the Spanish were, but still did not immediately grant Cuba independence, which most Cubans wanted. By 1901, a constitution was drafted and Cuba became supposedly independent. However, the Cuban constitution contained the Platt Amendment, which gave the USA the legal right to interfere in Cuban affairs in order to protect its interests whenever it saw fit. Cubans understandably saw this as not true independence. It was independence as long as the USA approved of it. Cuba remained friendly with the Americans, but some trust was lost. The rise of Batista and gangsterismo. In the first half of the 20th century, Cuba lurched back and forth from a democracy to a military dictatorship. Unfortunately, neither style of government did a good job of protecting the rights of the people. When it was a democracy, those in the Cuban government used their position to enrich themselves. When the military was in charge, they did whatever the U.S. government and the American businesses on the island wanted in order to keep the flow of American money and weapons coming. Cuba developed like many other Latin American nations. A few people had almost all the money, but most were terribly poor. In 1952, a former Army general named Fulgencio Batista took power in Cuba, ending the quest for true democracy for good, as it turned out. The U.S. government favored Batista because of his strong anti-communism and commitment to American business interests. They did not particularly care that he did next to nothing to improve the lives of average Cubans. Another American business also had an eye on Cuba. The American mafia saw the lack of government interference with anything that would bring U.S. dollars to the island and concluded that Cuba might be a great place to expand their gambling empire. American gangsters watched their power gradually go away since the repeal of Prohibition in the 1930s, and the idea of a place to operate safely out of the reach of the U.S. government was appealing. And there you see some of the main players when American gangsters moved into Cuba. You had the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista on the left, a New York gangster named Meyer Lansky, then another one named Lucky Luciano, and Sam Giancana from Chicago. He was kind of the heir to the Al Capone outfit. By paying bribes to Batista and his ministers, gangsters such as New York's Meyer Lansky and Lucky Luciano, as well as Chicago's Sam Giancana, opened up luxurious hotels and gambling casinos in Havana, much like they were already doing in Las Vegas, Nevada. Except in Cuba, there was nothing to fear from the FBI. Havana became the most popular tourist city in the Americas. It was close to the U.S., the weather was always beautiful, and the nightlife was some of the world's most exciting. Unfortunately, the prosperity from all of these American visitors rarely made its way back to the Cuban people. The money went to the American gangsters and Batista. Cubans began demanding change, and since they had few rights, there was no legal way for them to create change in their country. The 26th of July movement. One of the Cubans most dedicated to ending the rule of Batista was a former student named Fidel Castro. Castro became involved in student protests and later led a failed attack on a Cuban army base on July 26, 1953. After his defeat there, Castro and his men fled to Mexico, where they met to plot their next move. Along with his brother Raul Castro and an Argentine doctor-turned-revolutionary named Ernesto Che Guevara, they formed the 26th of July movement, named after their first failed attack. Their plan was to form an effective jungle force that could fight Batista's army for years, if necessary, before finally taking power. And there you see a picture of Fidel on the left, who ruled Cuba for 50 years, and then his brother Raul, who took over after Fidel died a couple years ago, and then Che Guevara. You may have seen his face on T-shirts and things like that. Castro's force of 82 men landed in Cuba in 1956 and was attacked by the Cuban Army and Air Force. Batista mistakenly announced Fidel's death after the battle. In fact, the revolutionary escaped and regrouped in the Sierra Maestra Mountains with only 12 men. Once in the mountains, the Castro brothers and Guevara did what they could to harass the Cuban army whenever possible. Meanwhile, Batista's government grew less and less popular among the people. In response, Batista brutally cracked down on any form of protest, no matter how peaceful. The more Batista tried to silence the protests of the people, the more the people supported Castro. The 26th of July movement was never especially strong in terms of military power. Sometimes there were less than 200 men in Castro's entire force. More and more Cubans, though, were upset with Batista's rule and were willing to support anyone who offered an alternative. Little was known about what Castro intended to do if he took power, but he was not Batista, and that was good enough for many Cubans in 1958. The Cuban army disintegrated in December 1958 as recruits defected from the army to Castro's side. On New Year's Eve 1958, Batista fled Cuba with as much of Cuba's wealth as he could carry. On January 1st, 1959, Castro's men entered the capital of Havana. Hopes were high among Cubans that a government that would care for the people was finally about to take power. Unfortunately, Castro had revenge on his mind. Without anything resembling a fair trial, he executed hundreds of Batista's supporters within days of his takeover. Castro's plans for government became clear too. Despite denying that he was a communist, it was obvious that Castro's government had communist leanings. Very shortly, he had the government take over almost all businesses in Cuba, including American ones. The USA responded by freezing all Cuban money kept in American banks and placing an embargo on Cuba. From that point forward, it was illegal for Americans to do any kind of business, including visit, with Cuba, a policy that remains in effect to this day. It is illegal for Americans to visit Cuba in any way, shape, or form. It's gotten a little bit easier over time, and it's fairly easy to get around the embargo, but that's been a policy that's been in place since 1959. It hasn't really gotten the government out of power, which is what it was designed to do, but it's something that has lasted. So it's something that what was a law in 1959 continues to be a law in 2020, even though it never has really worked. So that's what we've got for that one. You can go ahead and move on to the FBI notes. And